Thank you to you all. So we'll do a very quick round of intros so we can switch into the debate really quick. So let's start with you, Sam. Nice to meet you. Sam, you are working at Open Source Alliance. You are an AI leader. You are working and former Google employee. So you've been doing a lot of things in that field. We have Jordan. Jordan, we met on the call. Nice to meet you. You are a policy analyst at OSI, the Open Source Initiative, that we all know here, a non-profit organization that promotes and protects open source software. We do have Jamal. Jamal, nice to meet you. Jamal, you are professor at Paris Dauphine and vice president as well of the university, working in all research focusing on artificial intelligence, data science, machine learning, algorithm. We do have Albert. Nice to meet you, Albert. Albert, you're working for the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and the idea is really how we can reach high-performance computing. We do have Gilles Closset. So Gilles Closset, you are AI ecosystem lead at OVH Cloud, the leading cloud provider in France. And Stéphane, let's not forget Stéphane. So you have so many people. Nice to meet you, Stéphane. You are Technical Innovation Director at Gency, and Gency is a French organization responsible for managing as well high-performance computing infrastructure in France. So nice to meet you all. The idea of this roundtable is, while the history of open source is basically the history of internet itself. While we enter the AI era, new opportunities arise, new challenges does as well. In informed communities, as here, open source AI is the talk of the town, but under the same formula, many different realities are expressed. And this is exactly what our previous speaker said. Consensus is not always the answer. Where there is debate, it means there are people working, building, and hoping. And everyone around this table is united by the belief open source is not an option, but a necessity. That is something we can, I believe, all agree on as a good starting point. So we will start in the first part with success stories from the past, and Stéphane, we will let you know a bit about Bloom. Then we will move in defining open source, and Jordan and Sam, we will be talking all together. And the third part is on opportunities and challenges with Gilles, Albert, and you, Jamal. So let's start, Stéphane. Please, can you say to us a bit of the good story of Bloom?
Thank you very much. Thanks for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be there with you and with the colleagues. So I will perhaps start with few words, additional words about Gency. As you said, we are a public service, a public infrastructure, making available for free access to supercomputers for high-performance computing, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. If around the table here, around the room, there are some startups, researchers who want to access to supercomputers for your research, please contact us. We are a public service. I have nothing to sell you. We are at your service. We are giving access to close to 2,000 projects, and 60% last year were coming from AI. AI for science, AI for industry. We are supporting the training of tens or hundreds of models, private, open source, every year. And it's good, yes, to start with a nice story. And every often, nice stories are starting around a coffee. So the story of Bloom started around a coffee in Station F in 2021. I was sitting with Thomas Wolf, the CSO of Hugging Face, as well as Pierre-François Lavallée, the director of Idris, one of the computing centers, hosting the AI machine in France called Jean-Zé. And at this time, there were no open source model available in the world, no LLM, no open source LLM available. The world was driven by GPT. We are about to see GPT-3 coming, and we had this idea to say, why not creating from scratch an open source model? So this came to a project called Big Science, in which we have been able to rise, especially Hugging Face. I need to give the credit to Hugging Face, but they have been able to rise a global collaboration of 1,400 people around the world, public, private, any country, researchers, engineers, etc., and not only coming from usual suspect countries, also coming from Africa, India, South America, with the global wish to develop from scratch a true open source model. This has been done through different and various working groups, working on the choice of the datasets, the evolution of the datasets, the work on engineering, the work on the license, which is very important, the work on the specialization, generalization of the model, etc., etc. and also working on the supercomputer Janzé with the support of Idris. After a lot of training done on the machine, it came to a model called Bloom. It was a 170 billion parameters model, the same size as GPT-3. It has been released in 2022, in July, and it has become very popular and very used by a lot of people who wanted to test it, because what is the benefit of open source model is, at first you can test it very easily. You can use it locally with your data without exposing your data to private companies. So we see a lot of traction by using Bloom. A lot of companies in France, like I will mention EDF, for example, they wanted to use it for testing. So I'm here to talk about good news and not the good news, not bad news. So among the drawbacks we see is that it's something we can discuss later. Once you have a good foundational model, you need to put a lot of efforts on the specialization. And this is where perhaps one thing was lacking from Bloom, is that we were not supported by experts for providing service in fine-tuning and supporting the community in using this model. So perhaps it was one of the drawbacks. But Bloom was very successful. It's still downloaded. You can go on GameFace. You will see the statistics of download. It's still very downloaded. Even if it's not at the standard now, it's less trained in terms of tokens than the other model you can see now, but it's still used. I was very happy to see the slide of Amanda. Thank you very much for your presentation, because you saw some chart about the transparency index. And perhaps you mentioned that the number 2 model, even if it's old, is still Bloom Z. So it's one of the most open and transparent models you can still find now. So later we are going to discuss about this definition of open source, but I can give you as an example of what had been done previously on Bloom. And the two last points. So what was also interesting in Bloom is that this created a lot of a big ecosystem around open LLMs, and there are a lot of sons and daughters of Bloom now working in private companies. So you can go on Mistral, you can go on Lighton, you can go on AdaptML, on Meta. There are plenty of people who started their career working on Bloom and in GameFace. And my last point, and we can go back later, my biggest concern was the fact that Bloom was a research project. It was not aimed for doing business and commercial activities and inference at scale. And what was missing, it was Chat Bloom. We missed the Chat Bloom story. And this is because we didn't find European cloud providers in Europe able to have the guts and the GPUs to do what exactly did OpenAI with ChatGPT, to put a very naive and not very good at the beginning inference tool, making it available to the whole community for training it and performing a true success. So now we have Lucy, we have a lot of very nice open source model coming. Let's unite public and private facilities to not miss this rendezvous again.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. And you mentioned the question of infrastructure, and this is the last part of our debate, so don't forget, we'll come back to that. Let's cycle back on the tough question, defining open source. And as a way of putting everyone at ease, I would like Sam and Jonah to answer my first question: what is not open source AI?
Okay, look, I think that really the source for AI is the data on which it is trained. If you want to change the output for a given input, then you need to modify the data. It's not enough to know what the data is. You actually need reproducibility. So in open source, if you have the source and it produces the software, the binaries, the objects, then it is open source, right? So in platforms where you do have access to the data, and there's the question of data licensing and whether open source licenses can and should be used on data and vice versa, or whether it's just accessible in the case of things like Common Crawl, which is basically a dump of the internet. And a lot of these models do start by training on Common Crawl and other even more questionable kind of data sources in terms of content. But really that's to channel Simon Wardley here, the symbolic instructions for a software system in AI is the data, right? And a little anecdote, if I go back to I'm going to date myself a bit here, but the 90s, I was studying electrical engineering. I had a scholarship, and I was with a French company. I'm not going to name them here, but it was a French company, and they took me to their factory, and they said, here's where we're making the next generation of payphones, right? And there's a computer in here, and rather than doing the logic in the circuits, the guys next door are the ones like coding the system, and that's where the action is today. So all we're doing is like power supplies and this kind of stuff. And I said, okay, well, thanks for that. You'll find me in the next room, right? And so I went and transferred actually to computer science because that's where the action is. And going forward, I think we're going to see as a computer scientist this transition, right? And a lot of that stuff that I learned back then is not really relevant today. A lot of this stuff, we talked about Hinton and neural networks and so on was kind of just getting started. I'm now going back to school, studying at Georgia Tech, a master's in computer science, specializing in machine learning, with a view to being able to participate in this kind of next generation of software, where AI is not only writing the software, but being incorporated into the software. So we've got VLC's just been launched. It is open source code, but it incorporates a model now, Whisper, which is probably the thing that's doing the subtitles above my head now. And the question now is that open source, right? Because it's open source code, but I think we've heard from some of your colleagues that Whisper is not actually open source AI. So VLC now, we don't know if it's open source or not because there's two definitions defining the same thing. And what we're going to see going forward is that more and more software is going to be written by AI and is going to incorporate AI. And therefore, we really need to, if I speak to Bruce Perrins again, he says that we can use the open source definition as it is and apply it to software and separately to data in order to determine what is actually open source AI, right? And so what is not open source AI, to your question, is anything that doesn't include the data, right? And to that end, we've today announced the open weight definition, which allows you as a vendor who wants to release their software as open source but can't because they're not willing to make those commercial compromises that Amanda spoke to before, but they still want to use the term open source. So we say, okay, well, why don't you use the term open weight and we'll protect the freedoms to use and share the model without necessarily guaranteeing the freedoms to study and modify them.
Thank you so much, Sam, for answering the question. Jordan, this is something you've been working on for such a long time. This is an intense debate. Again, a consensus is not always the answer. I would like to have your opinion and on the definition. You have a definition, so I would like for you to share that and maybe give your opinion on where it's going.
Shall I start with the what is not open source AI?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So my name is Jordan. I work for the Open Source Initiative. We're an organization who's been working for 25 years to represent open source communities. And we're also the steward of the open source definition and work to approve or reject licenses on the basis of if they are or are not open source. I think, Sam, you're coming from a good place to start with. Yeah, obviously, the core principles of working out if something is open source or not are the principles laid out in the open source definition. Can you use it, study it, modify it? Can you redistribute it without restrictions? The issue that we have with that is that AI is not normal software. And so yeah, obviously, the importance of the model, the importance of the data, as you quite rightly mentioned, and also, of course, the cost of training, which is tremendous. You also talked about reproducibility. And during the process on the AID, this was one of the big issues that we run into. But a lot of the people who are AI practitioners were telling us that de facto perfect reproducibility is not a possibility. So we're dealing with a type of software which is very, very different to what we're used to. There is also a second problem. The second problem is that there are a handful of companies who stand to benefit from being able to open wash their products. This is actually partially my fault. Prior to joining the Open Source Initiative, I worked in the European Parliament. I worked on the AI Act, and I introduced the exception for open source software. Unfortunately, this has given companies an enormous incentive to open wash their software. So the question is really, how do we guarantee the 4 freedoms when we're using AI? There are open and shut cases. I mean, llama is one of them. Amanda, you mentioned that. Oh, and by the way, Amanda, I'm very sorry for the hyphen. I did put the hyphen in, but I have now learned my lesson. I will not hyphenate open source in the future. But yeah, so there are open and shut cases like llama. Also like, you know, derivatives of llama as well. It's the same story. I know, Sam, that you worked on a really interesting project which I've been following quite closely called POSAIS, which uses llama at its core. The question as to if it is or isn't open source is a big one, and that's kind of what we've been trying to solve. I think, do you want me to go into the definition, or should we come back to that?
I think what I would just like is to have the opinion of Jamal, because I saw you nodding on that, and if it's okay with you, I would just like to have your reaction, especially when it comes to reproducibility and how researchers, how do researchers look at that question? Because defining things is definitely what researchers do.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I was agreeing with both of you. For me, the keyword is reproducibility. So it's not open source if we cannot reproduce the result. To reproduce the result, we need the data, of course. We need how to build the model. We need the science behind. We need open science. We need publications. This is how we work in the community. We need to continue publishing our work. But yeah, I do agree that AI is not any software, it's not any algorithm, because we are missing something here, is the hardware. We need all the process. We need science, but we need really, really extremely high-level engineering. It's a new engineering, it's a new world where engineering and science are mixed somehow. But we need also optimization in the hardware and how the hardware works. So yeah, we're focusing on open source, on the software, but we should also focus on the hardware part. So yeah, for me, the key word is reproducibility. So if we cannot reproduce the result, then it's not open source. This is why I was agreeing with this.
So maybe what we could do, thank you so much, Jamal. Maybe Jordan, you could go into the definition, and then Sam, you could bounce back on what does it mean? I mean, what does it take to have the capacity to reproduce, because we see that it's very hard to reproduce entirely, but at the same time, this is what we need. So yeah, maybe you can start on the definition, to give what formally you did put down on paper.
Before we go there, if it's okay, my question is reproducibility the goal with AI? Because essentially, if you've already got a built version of the model, does it make sense to expend tremendous amounts of resources to reproduce the exact same thing? And I do agree and understand that when it comes to software, of course, absolutely, reproducibility is vital. But when it comes to AI, it's different. The people who are going to want to retrain a model from scratch, they're not going to want to reproduce exactly the same thing. The reason that they're going to be doing it is because they want to produce something different. And so I think that assertion, we do need to reconsider it. But I'll move on to the definition. So one of the key problems that we're going to have in the next couple of years is the risks of artificial intelligence. We've all seen that there are already cases of discrimination. There are, AI systems which evaluate CVs, which choose candidates for computer science positions purely on the basis of if they did football at school. There are recidivism algorithms in the United States which send people of color to prison more often than Caucasians. There are so many problems associated with that. And so the goal of open source for software is to give people agency and control, to give them those 4 freedoms, right, that we talked about earlier. And in order to apply that to open source AI, we have to face up to a lot of challenges, a lot of things that we've not done before. And just to be clear, like, OSI is not the only one who's saying about these challenges. The Free Software Foundation, who Amanda mentioned earlier, have been saying that there are some cases where an AI model developer might not be able to ethically release the data they use to train their system. And that system will be non-free in their view, but it is ethical to use it. So they can recognize that problem. Meanwhile, the Software Freedom Conservancy have said it could take a decade for us to get to a point where we really have a solid definition, a solid answer to the question. Both of those people, both of those organizations are absolutely correct about that. But the problem is society and lawmakers aren't waiting. So that is the reason that the Open Source Initiative has gone ahead and started work on the OSAID. Of course, another great reason is that a handful of companies have very successfully convinced lawmakers and developers that the same rules don't apply for AI than for software. So they challenge essentially the fact that the OSD is a valid way of evaluating if AI is open source or not. We disagree, but we think that the OSID provides more information. So I'll talk just very, very briefly about the process. We had a process with people from all backgrounds. Cedric made the very, very good point earlier that there are people who are not well represented, in particular women, but also the Global South. We made an effort, 1/3 of the people participating were women, trans, or non-binary. 40% were people of color, 30% were from the Global South. We managed to go to 5 continents. Unfortunately, Oceania wasn't one of them, nor was Antarctica, so sorry for the penguins. But we did our very best to try to reach out to as diverse and interesting a group of people as possible. I also think that that is the reason that Bloom, for example, was so successful, because of the diversity in the people who were building it. We had people who were coming from companies. We had people who were from academia. We had researchers. We had actual AI practitioners. There were people from Bloom who participated in the process. There were people from ELU for AI as well in the United States who participated in the process. So we tried to get as many people to the table as possible, on the basis, of course, that obviously we weren't always going to be able to agree on everything, and we were trying to compromise. So what does the OSAID actually require? Well, it requires that you publish the code that you use for data processing and filtering to prepare your data set, for the training of the model, and for its use. So everything you need from start to finish. It requires that you publish the parameters, the weights, and any other configuration which comes with the model. It also requires that you publish the training data to the extent possible. Now, this, to the extent possible, is where it becomes controversial. So let's just say what you have to have, regardless of the type of data, regardless. You have to give a complete description. You have to include its origin. You have to include its type, its scope, and its characteristics. This is whether the data can be published or not. You have to list where any publicly available data can be found. But the problem is the third category, which is unshareable data. So there's some data that it's simply not possible to share, and there are multiple reasons for this. The first is that some data simply isn't retained. So let's say, for example, that you have a radio telescope and you're looking out into the far universe. The amounts of data that you're collecting are not going to be retainable. You might be able to feed it into your model for the purpose of training, but keeping all that information might not be practical or even feasible. So that's the first case. The second case we have is medical data. Now, for very obvious reasons, people might not be happy with us publishing all of their CT scans as part of a model. We want there to be open source medical AI. We think that it's vital. We think that for the trustworthiness of AI systems, these sorts of systems should be able to exist. And forcing patients to share for the purpose of achieving this, we don't think is fair. So that's one point where there's a thing. But there are also 2 other points which are extremely challenging. And if we hadn't created this exception, they would have made the OSAID legally unworkable. And those are personal data and copyright. Now, if you're a company based entirely in the United States, and you have personal data of European users, and you publish that personal data, in the United States, you're not in trouble. In Europe, you are. If you build an image generation data set and you use certain Italian artworks in that data set, which would be considered public domain in most countries in the world, you'll be in trouble in Italy. If the same applies if you take the St. James's Bible. In most countries in the world, public domain, no problem, no one's going to come after you. In the UK, Crown copyright. So you could, in the country where you're publishing your open source AI system, it could be completely open source. In another country, it might not. And this has created a real challenge for us. So we essentially made these exceptions, not as I've heard repeatedly, to facilitate the lives of developers, but because we had to have a definition that was legally workable. We had to have that so we could go to lawmakers and explain to them what open source AI is. Because if we go to them with a definition that does not make legal sense, that is not legally applicable, we'll be laughed out the room. And frankly, as somebody who's spent a long time in Brussels, I can say to you clearly, there are only two competing visions for open source AI in Brussels right now. It's the OSAID and Meta's anything goes approach. And I much prefer the OSAID. Now, the OSAID isn't perfect. None of us are claiming it is. And in this coming year, we'll be working a lot on making it better. The process will be reopening actually quite shortly to continue work on improving it. But we have to face it that there are two competing visions, and right now, the other one is winning the battle. We have the opportunity to have a starting position which allows us to fight back. If we miss this opportunity, then unfortunately Meta's vision will be the one that wins. So my message from OSI to everyone is, we really want you to come and participate in the process in the coming year to try and improve it further. But we need a starting point from which we can advocate for open source AI, and the OSID is that starting point. Thanks.
Thank you, Jordan. Everything that you said just made me want to say a little joke that I had in mind actually before coming here about reproducibility. Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I think it speaks a lot to what we just had before. Sam, I would like to have your opinion about that. You were mentioning, and I think, Jordan, you were making a very good point about the fact that, we need a definition that, of course, bloom within a specific regulatory framework. And I'm fully aligned on that. The other point is, but the regulatory framework can change a lot and sometimes needs to be changed. So I would like to have, maybe like your opinion, Sam, on what was just said. I know that you are advocating to go further in a certain extent, and I would like to have your opinion about that.
Yeah, well, look, let me start by looking at the concept of source, right? The source of this water bottle is not the bottle itself. So you can't have a model and say it is its own source, right? Open source is like, which glacier did it melt off, or which mountain stream was it collected from, and so on. So typically we refer to, in this case, source code, which then goes through a compilation process to be transferred to an object form. And in the case of AI, we have data, which is trained or composted or minced or into a model, which you can then use for inference. Now, if you want to know what's gone into that model, then you need to see the data, right? And if you want to look for ethical issues like fairness and bias, you need to see the data. If you want to add data, there's an element of fine-tuning you can do. So you have a limited ability to study and modify the system, but really you need the data to be able to remove data or to add your own data to it. So again, this is where the data is essentially the symbolic instructions that you need to change if you want to have a different output for a certain input. And again, going to the question of reproducibility, with open source software, if the source produces the software, it is open source. Okay, so really the data kind of drops in for the code. There is code as well, right? We talk about kind of three legs of the stool: code, model, and data. The code really, in this sense, is just life support for the model. It's kind of like read line, take the prompt, feed it to the model, which is animated by it, and then take the output and do whatever it is that you want with the output. So I think that's another important point. Now, one of the things that we know as well is that AIs can not only hallucinate, but they have recall with photographic memory. So they can produce data that they've been trained on, right? And you don't even have to put a gun to their head. Often they will just produce it randomly. And there was a case of that recently where there was somebody who was playing chess and it produced their personal identifiable information. So, but if you deliberately try and interfere with any guardrails that are in place, then you can actually get it to divulge the information it was trained on. So using this obscurity, and we say there's no security in obscurity, so saying we're going to hide personally identifiable information or medical data or some other data we don't want to be released, it just doesn't work like that, because we know these models can, in certain circumstances, either randomly or when encouraged, produce this training data. And so one of the other aspects of this is that we need to be able to, as countries, I'm Australian, I moved here 20 years ago to Europe. I now spend a lot of time in Canada for access to Silicon Valley and so on. But we need to be able to protect our digital sovereignty, right? And part of that is not like building our, in the case of the UK, NHS, on top of these models that were trained on social media posts, right? We need to have that data so that we can introduce, for example, here, French language, French culture, French concepts, and potentially remove other data which might be problematic. And so to that end, you know, it's just not fit for purpose anymore. You know, we talk about success. Open source is now in 97% of software. 9 in 10 enterprises build on top of open source systems and libraries. There is $8.8 trillion of economic activity on top of open source, which is a relatively small industry of $30 billion today, growing to $80 billion by 2030, right? And we want to replicate that success with AI. And as a practitioner, as a developer, I want to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants, and I can't do that if I'm building on top of a model that does not give me the data, right? Because that's what I change in order to make the transition from a programmer to a practitioner. It's the data that I'm working with. And so to that end, you know, because this model of a single organization in a single country kind of, you know, defining this stuff has worked, because it was a couple of fellow Debian developers in the 90s who actually wrote the Debian Free Software Guidelines and released the open source definition, and actually founded the open source initiative, 2 of which have actually been banned from it. So that's an interesting context. But what we're doing as one of the official AI convergence challenges on global governance at the AI Action Summit is we're launching the Open Source Alliance, which with a view to appointing national standard bearers and having them participate in the discussion and saying, look, it's not adequate that, you know, one country or one organization is the only one with a voice, particularly on such contentious topics. And we're not saying we need to have unanimity, but typically in internet standards, we look for rough consensus where we at least address any outstanding concerns before releasing, for example, a standard on HTTP or HTML or other things. And so that's kind of, rather than building an umbrella, we're more looking to go for an agile, like servant leadership model, where we kind of promote other countries like France to have a voice in the discussion and say, look, this is what we need in order to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants and build the next generation of technology.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, round of applause as well. We don't want to stop that. I feel like going into the question of the infrastructure is what we need now. Like, we've having quite a long talk about the definition, and the definition is important, but you know how it appears in the real world and how people experience it is all thanks to the infrastructure. So I would like to have the opinion from Jill and Albert on that, and Stefan, of course, I will ask for you to join in the discussion again. But maybe just step down and talk a bit about infrastructure before we can go to opportunities and challenges. Because, I mean, we kind of like touched them during the discussion, but having a real clear vision about what are the opportunities and what are the trade-offs, because in everything in life there are trade-offs. You know, I think it's important to enlighten people about what those are and what are the real opportunities. So, Gilles, maybe if you might step in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, let me first introduce OVH Cloud and some of our past successes in open source so that we all better understand where we come from. So OVH Cloud is the European leading cloud provider. We have been founded in 1999, and we are HQ'd here in Paris. We manage 43 data centers pretty much across the world, and we serve 1.6 million customers. Since the creation of the company, actually, we had some core values in the company: transparency, trust, reversibility. We have been a leading pioneer for a trusted and sovereign cloud. And actually, to achieve this commitment to those values and to remain true to our promises, we relied a lot on open source technologies which have the same values. And one of our key success from the past is our public cloud offering, actually. That is, it has been created back in 2012, so it's already 14 years old. And actually, we rely on OpenStack from the Open Infra Foundation. And today, we are one of the largest, actually, implementation of OpenStack worldwide. We have hundreds of thousands of instances there. And this allows us to, one, innovate faster, have a fast pace of feature release for our customer, while giving those guarantees to our customer that there are no vendor lock-in if they want to remove the workload and the instances from our platform. While it's an open source technology, they can reproduce it on premises if they want or somewhere else. And this is really one of the key values that we try to keep across our portfolio of products. Talking, indeed, about AI and the definition, for us, it's important to have covered the three main pillars that we mentioned, the models, about the algorithm, and the architecture of the model. This is to make progress and to see how the model works itself, the open weights, how we can have access to the parameters, and then when we implement projects, it's the way we do fine-tuning. And open data. This is really important because this is how we can ensure safety of the models, see whether there are some biases, and comply with the future regulation. And I think we will talk further about this later on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Albert, I'm turning towards you so we can have maybe your opinion from Barcelona. You've been doing a lot of work on, supercomputer, but you're also working in this community, foreigner community for France. How do you feel about this whole debate about defining, and how, from someone who's working on very, concrete power system as well as communities, what's your input on that?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Albert. I work at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, which is one of the supercomputing part of Euro HPC. We've recently been awarded as an AI factory also, so the access to the supercomputer will be more possible for the industry. Apart from a supercomputer, there is a lot of research activity on top of these facilities. And one of the research activities is on the development of large language models on the language technology department. And in this area, I'm dealing mostly with tech transfer, helping to move. It's one of the challenges that you mentioned on the Bloom case, just to. And there are a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities on this front. Echoing a little bit on some of the conversations or some of the comments of the colleagues before, it's very hard to be close, to be compliant with the definitions that we've heard. Working on the development of these models, especially on topics of complete reproducibility. That's hard because some of the data is not available or cannot be reshared for others to reproduce the process. And as you said, probably the purpose should not be the complete reproducibility, but the inspection. And I think our model is quite close to the definition. It would be interesting to fact check that. And another thing that has not been raised so much so far, it's all the legal issues on the data licenses and how it has been quite hard to work with our own internal legal department and with the funders of our projects, which are usually public governments, either the regional Catalan government or the Spanish government, and there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of gray space. So that creates a lot of doubts on how to move forward on that space. That's one of the challenges on that space. Also on the tech transfer that you mentioned, the experience with Bloom, at least as a research center, we focus very much on the creation of the model, and we just have a more or less fairly new department from 1 year and a half old, who is focusing on strategizing on how to move forward, how to move the research to the market in a structured way with support, helping people fine-tune models, providing some easy access to inference. It's not our role in the market to inference the models. There are other players who can do that, but we need to bridge, we need to simplify as much as possible. And last but not least, also echoing a lot on the previous presentation, there's a challenge, I think, and we haven't talked also about the money, the business model, the sustainability of all this, because it's very expensive to do that. On this initial round, okay, there is public money that is funding these initiatives. There's a lot of hype. We have the opportunity to do that, but if we want to keep that in the mid-long term, we might need to add some friction that might conflict with pure open source definitions, but that might make the models more viable. So, and it's not clear how to do that. And yeah, I'll probably stop here, and then we can go back to some other topics.
From what you just said, I think this is exactly what we meant when we were talking about trade-off. That's definitely one of the trade-offs we have to think about when we want to build long-term and sustainable. And I think the question of sustainability of open source model is important. But as you said, the issue with defining something clear is rather than being, oh, I'm within the definition, I am not, it's just also important to give clarity to people, because at a certain point there is a question of acceptability and people want to understand what words means. And this is why, defining open weight and maybe having the question of open source, open innovation and all of that is really important, because we lack clarity. And, that's not something that's going to be achieved in 1 year, maybe not in 2, but I do think that when it comes to what people are going to use in their daily lives, understanding something and having the capacity to see the nuances or the binary behind, those models is really important. I would like to hear you again, Jamal, when it comes to opportunities and challenges. I don't know if it's you or if it's Stefan, but someone mentioned the question of sovereignty. That's definitely something important, and I think Stefan, working in a French agency, that's something you are really, really focusing on. There is also the question of security, so I don't know to what extent, Jamal, you would like to dig into that. And then, yes, just generally going into the trade-offs, so we can definitely see what are the opportunities and what do we need to do so they become real, and so they pave the future we are working in. So maybe Stefan in the question of sovereignty, and then Jamal.
Yes, I can jump on sovereignty. So sovereignty is even higher than since yesterday. We are a sovereign infrastructure, so GenC is owned by the French state. We are providing a public service, a sovereign public service. We are engaged, like Albert and all many players in Europe, in a sovereign infrastructure called EuroHPC, because at a given time, when we fight against US and China, we need to be united at the European level. This is mission of EuroHPC. So it's really important because having this kind of sovereign and public infrastructure allow inclusiveness and fairness for people accessing and making their research properly and at the same level of competition. If you have only paying access for your research, either you are rich, either you cannot enter the game. So having public infrastructure, it's a sovereign asset we need to defend. Of course, it's not easy, and I really like to thank the public service in France and the government for providing this permanent support, because we are doubling the capacity every year, and we need to do that, otherwise we are out of the game. So it's not so easy, but what is also very important, again, I would like to emphasize the fact that we also need to implement this public and private connection with European cloud providers, because we need to allow very easily in the same cloud one day to use public facilities for research, another day in the same cloud to jump to OVH cloud and make inference at scale. This is very important because in front of us, we have very strong actors, more powerful than states now. So it's really important really to go on that. Sovereignty is also a question, not only a question of machines, it's also a question of skills. So it's really important. One of the key success in France of Janzé was not only the machine, the GPU, but the support provided the team of CNRS at Idris. So it's really important to invest on skills. Because there are so many challenges and skills is as important, brains as important as the machines. One of my Santa Claus gift this year was the reading of the technical report from DeepSeek. So we can talk about DeepSeek. Okay, they are Chinese, but they are smart. Because, as you know, they are under constraint of US ban for export of GPUs. But what they did is they trained only with 2,000 GPUs, not H100, H800, which are lower in terms of performance than H100 because of US export rules. They train the most efficient open source. We can discuss about the scope of their open source approach, but it still seems to be an open source project. The most efficient LLM in the world with 600 billion parameters on only 2,000 GPUs. So not having the horse computing power of Elon Musk with only 2,000 GPU, exactly the capacity or a bit less than what we have in France, in Angers. But what they did, they used their brain also. So there was the first one, for example, to use FP8 for the training. There are a lot of tricks inside the paper. That means that this competition is not only a competition of GPU. Okay, we need to have GPUs, but we need to have brains. We need to have people collaborating together. This is the key. I used to say I'm not pessimistic. I think if we want to compete with the US, we have lost the battle in infrastructure. It's already lost. We can sustain the battle. Of course, you need to have more GPUs. I'm not going to be so pessimistic. We need to have GPUs, but where we can sustain the battle is on skills and open source models. This is where we can sustain and perhaps win the battle against some private actors who want to rule the world, actually.
And I think it gives, the perfect flow. And so maybe, Jamal, you can tell us a bit more about the ambition of PSL, because I know they are quite strong, and there were some of announcements recently about how big PSL wants to go. So maybe you can tell us a bit more how you are training the brains and making sure that skills are still growing and flourishing in France.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk that much about PSL, but I want to complete about that. For me, yeah, the model of the battlefields, of the battles is keeping brains. For me, this is where sovereignty lies, really. Keeping the brains here in France, in Europe, so as we can, well, of course, yeah, the gift of DeepSeek was quite awesome because they just show us that we can do, yeah, with good people, with good techniques, something that we cannot imagine 3 months ago, that we can come up with models that are that strong but with less resources. So yeah, that means that this opens new perspectives, and they could do that because they had their brains. So for me, this is important. Yeah, a short story about how we set up, well, I think 6 years ago, Jonze facility. Well, we coordinated with another colleague in this, during Villani's report. Another report, well, the name of the report was Génial. That was a joke. In English, that means great. And there were two main recommendations: infrastructure, but also a team of engineers to help researchers to develop their models, to optimize their models. And I think that is a real success here in France to have this, Jonze, but also the engineering team that is with the infrastructure facility. So, and thanks to people from Gency, it wasn't easy at that time to tell to people that used to work on high-performance computing, well, guys, now we will have a part of the machine that will be dedicated to AI. I think that for them it wasn't something that easy to set up, and we did it. So yeah, well, going back to the other part of the question, well, you know that here in France we have these AI clusters now. So we had these interdisciplinary AI institutes as part of the implementation of Villani's report. Well, we had 4 institutes, and now we have which is a good thing, 9 AI clusters in France, and each cluster gather people on research, education, but we also work with companies. And I'm in the management team of one of these clusters, which is Paris School of AI. We are building this Paris School of AI in PSL. And the idea is, well, to do basic research, fundamental research in AI, but also AI for the science. And this is one of the points that I want to put in the front in the discussion. We've been focusing a lot, I think, on large language models. But for me, the other revolution is in AI for the science and how AI is reshaping how we do science. And I'm going to take the example of AlphaFold, because for me, it's exemplary, it's paradigmatic on how first data has been produced by research communities. Keep in mind that AlphaFold is, well, Cedric mentioned it in his introduction, it's about protein folding. They solved part of the problem that is known for decades. But in terms of applications, think about material sciences, molecular design, drug discovery, just to mention a few. But this is, for me, the hidden revolution of AI. And the story is interesting because people don't know that all the data that these models have been trained on come from this European laboratory, the European Microbiology Laboratory. So people worked on collecting data for almost 3 decades, and all this data has been used to train the AlphaFold model. So, yeah, and people in DeepMind, I had this discussion with them, they weren't convinced that they should publish all the science behind, all the engineering behind. That was a discussion inside DeepMind. And when we think how these kind of technologies will reshape the way we do science, reshape the way we discover new materials, design drugs, then we should keep in mind that we are somehow in kind of a battle with these people, where we can work together. They use data that has been, as I said, gathered, prepared by scientists. By the way, European scientists. That was kind of a success story of how people, when they work together, they can come up with something really great. And then these people, we should have this discussion with them as soon as they use the data that has been produced by public money, let's say, they should publish, they should open their science. Then the battle here is about open science. Okay, so keep in mind that we need open science, and that will be my take. Well, I didn't answer the question about security, if I may.
that is fine. But thank you for the intake about open science, open innovation. Yeah, you can round of applause. So just highlighting the fact that after defining open source AI, we need also, like open source AI, we also come from an open ecosystem in very different diagonals, as you were saying with open innovation and open science. To you, Jill and Albert, I'm coming back on the trade-off. While we were preparing the call, you mentioned that open source AI is not free. And I think that's something important, and I would like you to explain a bit more to the audience, because sometimes there can be this misconception, about open source. Oh yeah, this is something we can just, like use, and that's okay, we don't need money for that. That's actually quite the contrary, and maybe you could, dig a bit into that.
Yeah, well, it's a common, let's say, understanding that open source is resource intensive in terms of maintenance. So it requires time, it requires expertise, it requires technical resources as well. But well, with that comes some benefits, right? And for us, it was very important to be able to use open source technology so that we can customize the solution to our own needs. And as you may know, we have a very specific industrial model. We are manufacturing our own servers with our own water cooling technology. And well, we have a very specific context, and we had to develop customized software to accommodate our infrastructure, and this was only possible with open source. And we like to say that actually we are kind of paying our debt toward the community by developing new models and features and sharing it with the wider community. So I think this is one of the principles of the open source, and we are very happy to have this trade-off, because at the end of the day, I think it benefits us all. When you think about the success of internet in the past, it has relied very much on open source technology. We had open source web servers, we had open source browsers, we had open source code to develop the websites, even the protocols to communicate the data was open source. When you look at what's going on in AI today, I think one of the biggest differences, what we just said about infrastructure, is the phenomenal investment requirements that we have to do in order to train models. And yeah, this is definitely a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge for the communities to have access to those large-scale infrastructure. So thank you. Thankfully, we already have institutions like Jancy and the Barcelona Supercomputing Center to head them, but as we discussed before the roundtable, they are already overused and need always more capacity, especially to compete with the super infrastructure from the US. So this is one thing. And when we talk about trust that we need to have in AI and reversibility, and the challenges about that, when you look at some of the services from the big AI companies out there, some of them, they offer a fine-tuning service with their proprietary model. So that means that actually you have to share your private data as a company. And as you know, your data set as a company is one of the most critical assets that you have. And you really have to have trust to share it. That's one thing. And the other thing is when you do those fine-tuning with their model, actually, because it's proprietary, the fine-tuned model, the output of this is not your ownership. You are not the owner of the fine-tuned model. It remains their model. I think you really have to have a lot of trust to a third-party company to give them your private data set, and they keep the fine-tuned model at the end of the day. So this is really a challenge, and that's why we really need to rely on open source models and alternatives.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you said about trust, and this is why we need clarity, because the clarity on the definition, the clarity on what is open source, what is open wide, is indeed needed, so we can, create trust. And this is why I would say that days like that are so important, so people can get to understand what is at stake, and then we can build trust as a shared ecosystem. Albert, turning to you, and then I will have the final word from everyone. But I would like you to start. Is from what you've been working on, what would be, how can we promote truly open AI? And that will be the question I will ask to all of you. But Albert, I would like for you to start with a bit more time than everyone else. But how, for you, can we promote truly open AI?
That's a complicated one. First, I think gathering in person, it's important, and encounters like this one and the one that's happening also in 2 weeks and others that have been mentioned. So I think that's the first, to build personal trust among the people working on these projects. And the other, probably, I would say it's also important to use the proper metaphor to help work together. And we hear a lot about the CERN of AI, but for us, this narrative is a little bit too centralized. It's like a single point where everything happens. There is an article co-written by the director of a Barcelona Supercomputing Center, who is proposing more the AI bus, in the same way that we have the Airbus, as a collective way of engaging in a complex project like building airplanes. And every part of Europe is contributing with different parts of the facility. So we need probably to find what is the narrative, what is the way we can engage together, understanding, and it has been mentioned that the basis of everything is the data. Everybody's collecting data and more or less sharing it, but probably not collaborating enough, so starting from the data. Models, probably people will want to experiment, and I think it's good. It's part of this, the key word that we heard in the beginning of the open source, of the AI strategy in France was experimentation. So I think once we coordinate on the data front, then we can have different research institutes to try different techniques, because now everybody's focused on the same techniques, but it's important the diversity. And yeah, and also I think going together to Europe, for example, one of the challenges that I mentioned at the beginning was on the legal front. And we've been contacting other European institutions in Scandinavia, in Italy, in Portugal. And everybody's facing the same issue. And I think it's important that when we find some of these common gray areas, we can bond together and find the right door at European level, now that the new Commission is more or less starting to be active, and we have the AI office and the AI board and other. So sure. I would say narrative, let's agree on how we want to collaborate together. A lot of focus on data. There are already infrastructures or the beginning of infrastructure like Altedic and others, but I think we need more, and for me there's not enough clarity on that. A lot of experimentation, and then bonding together on specific issues that are a common challenge.
Thank you so much. Everyone, we're trying to have like 5 minutes time for Q&A, so I would like to have one last word from each of you, but very short. My question is the same. What can deciders do to promote truly open AI? And I would like each of you to give only one idea in only one sentence, so we can then turn to the public and open the questions. Stefan, you may start. If you feel like it. Oh, let's give you some time, because you were been talking quite a lot. Let's start with Jordan and Sam. They've been quiet for a while now.
One sentence.
Yes.
Collaborate, work together, and respect each other's views.
That's a lot of ideas, but we can make that work. Thank you, Jordan.
Look, I think that the importance of language here is paramount. We need to make sure that the definition of open source is meaningful, and that you are, as a company, as a country, as an individual, you are actually able to build the next generation of technology on the last, and for that you do need the data.
Thank you.
Yeah, my advice to promote open source in AI could be applicable to everyone, I think, here in the room, and this is what we have done at OVH Cloud, is actually to use open source AI technologies. There are already a lot there, VLLMs, Olama, Kubeflow, and so many other long chain and open source models. It's when we use them that we make them standards, and when they become standards, they are much stronger. And so the more we are using them, the stronger it will be.
Thank you. Jamal?
Yeah, my last word is it's nice to discuss, to have this kind of discussion, but let's move to action, because we are in the AI Action Summit. So
that's why we are only Round-table1. We have 3 others to go, and believe me, lots of action will be there.
That was my way to not answer the question.
Thank you, I saw that. Stefan?
So we are in the action. So one of the outcomes of the Action Summit could be to develop as a common good an open source multimodal model with, for example, all the spoken language in the world, which is be owned by United Nations, for example, but as a common good, because this cannot be owned by private parties. So this could be an action that the Action Summit could develop.
That's definitely what we'll be talking about in table 3 about universal open source AI. Let's turn to the public. Does anyone have a question? I do believe we have Mike. We can. Oh no, she does have a mic. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought Justin from the OSI really beautifully explained his basis for the definition of the OSAID. But one of the things that I think is a challenge, and I'm interested in hearing more about, is that when we look at the open source software definition, It means that anyone can use the code for any purpose. In open source, we don't try to define laws. We don't try to accommodate laws. Every country has different laws, and we leave that to the policymakers. We leave that to the regulators. And I think one of the real challenges you have, and you're creating a definition that will always be running to catch up, is that you are trying to create regulation. We shouldn't care about the confidentiality. We shouldn't care about data privacy. Those are things for the creators of the data. Those are things for the owners of the data. Those are things for the regulators. And I think you will never create a definition that's successful while you try to do that. So I'd be interested in hearing more about why you have this massive shift away from the principles of open source in that definition.
Thank you. Just take if there is another question, because you have 3 minutes to go, so I would like to, we're going to just collect them and then give the capacity to answer.
Hi, actually it's more of a question for Alberto. I'm a big fan of Salamandra. I'm a user of Salamandra. I think it's fantastic. Did you collaborate with the larger community as engineers? Because it seemed very mysterious. Suddenly there was a fantastic European model, fully open source, and I must have missed it.
Thank you. Do we have one last question, and then we can go just here?
Thank you. My question is about the cybersecurity side of the open source AI. I mean, can you provide us some ways to deal with that? Because I think it is a matter not particularly discussed, but it is a crucial issue, especially if we are talking about sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So who wants to take Amanda's question? Who wants to take Albert's question? I mean, sorry, it's for Albert. And the last one, security. You want to take Amanda's one? Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks for the question, Amanda.
Very short.
And yeah, I spent the last 3 years writing regulations. I guarantee you we definitely don't want to be doing that. Essentially, to put it down to a short thing, it's not about imposing restrictions. It's about ensuring that the people who are developing open source AI can actually achieve it without running into serious problems. And I'll add again, we're at a starting point. We have something that we can work from. In the next year, we're going to be refining it. It may be that the restrictions, well, not the restrictions, but it may be that these things are not necessary. And hopefully that will be the case. We will see as time goes on and also as the legislative environment evolves. The last point that I want to make about that, though, is that we'll have to work together on this in the future. We will need time, and I really just want to call again for everybody to come around the table and help us to make the definition better. Thanks.
Thank you. Albert, please.
Thank you. No, obviously there has been collaboration with other research institutes around Europe. I would encourage you to go. There was a new model published yesterday, 2 days ago, called ALIA, which is also, and if you go into the model card on the hiring phase page, you'll see on the data sources all the different countries that have contributed to this massive data set, and there's obviously a lot of collaboration with Germany, Italy, and many others. We've been a little bit, as you said, mysterious or not very visible, if you want, because we're doing actually this work, and now coming here and other events, we plan to open, to be more visible on this collaboration on one side. But I'm happy to have a chat with you later on that.
Thank you. And when it comes to cybersecurity, maybe Samia can start and then Jamal can complete.
Yeah, the reason why I wanted to comment on this is because it goes to the question of data again. If you want to find the needle or needles in the haystack, you need absolutely to have the data. And I actually wrote an article about this, and I've spilled a lot of digital ink on the topics of the OSI and definitions and data and so on samjohnston.org. But one of the articles was about how 11 out of the top 10 OWASP, top 10 for LLMs, is actually either enabled or exacerbated by opacity in the data, right? because you just don't have a chance. The reason I say 11 is because I reviewed one of the drafts, right? So none of us here maybe are experts to your point about in AI, which is why I'm going back to school to sharpen the tools. But I have been doing cybersecurity for quite a while, so I do appreciate that that is another very strong reason for making the data available. And a definition that doesn't require the data, or it says, here, we've got really nice data, but a sufficiently skilled person should be able to recreate it by themselves, right? Just doesn't help in the security arena at all.
Jamal, can you complete, and then we will finish roundtable.
When we talk about cybersecurity and AI, the relationship goes in both sides, right? So we can make all these models vulnerable to new attacks. Well, they are, and the bad news is that the threats grow with the size of the model. So we can, there's all this subject around adversarial attacks of these models. We can change the prediction of the model very easily, by the way, and it's very, very hard to defend against these attacks. We can hijack the models. That means that we can misalign them. We can use these models for misinformation, of course, but this is not new. But we can operate at large scale, high speed, and this is a new threat. So there are a lot of data breach, member inference, reconstruction attack on privacy. So, okay, these are models that are studied in the community, but we don't have the solutions. We know that it's a hard problem, but we need open source models to study these threats and these new threats. So this is, in the first direction. On the other direction, we can, of course, we can use large language models because we can now generate codes, so new viruses, so this will be easier than before. But on the other side, we can use AI to protect against these attacks. So we can use AI for defense. So this is why we need research on these subjects that are serious subjects. But to do that, we need open source models and open data.
Thank you so much, Jamal. So on that point, I would like to close this roundtable. I would like to thank you all. We're going to move into action, into what we can use, because that's what you were saying, preparing for the future and giving people a choice. Here's come Lucy. This is the next topic we're going to cover. Thank you so much to all. Please stand up so you can have a picture. Thank you to the audience.